concerning the Gospel of Mark, and this is something that, well, you'll see why it's confusing. Why scholars don't like it. Why inerrancy proponents don't like it. The inerrancy proponents of dictation, basically, and why people who well, I don't know if they actually believe it. Bart Ehrman certainly doesn't believe it. But there's certain historians, I guess you'd call them, that try to say Jesus never existed, or the mythicists don't like it, and it's for the reasons why I'm going to spell out right now. Now, unfortunately, I don't have um, the. This is a different copy of the NASB. I don't have the one where I actually marked down, counted out immediately, something like 26 times within the first two chapters. For anybody out there that doesn't know how long a chapter of the Bible is, it's about a half a page, or maybe a page to 2 pages if you're lucky. That's how long a chapter is. Now, Mark, I suspected, was written by an eyewitness, and then I stumbled across what Papias said. And you'll notice that in Mark, you have scholars have always suspected that there was an early passion narrative before any of the Gospels were written. That passion narrative is the latter part of Mark, because 1/3 of Mark is different. I mean, it concerns itself entirely with the passion narrative or the final conflict, and then the first 2/3 immediately comes up, immediately, and it almost has no teachings. I'll read to you what Papias said, and remember, Papias, by all his contemporaries, is called a very old man. He's very old, and he was a contemporary of Papias, or not Papias, Polycarp, Ignatius of Antioch, and he was the disciple of John. Yeah, so he's writing around AD 100, and he's a very, very old man. If he knows Polycarp and Ignatius of Antioch, Ignatius of Antioch died in 115, and knew Ignatius, but in the three of them were said to be disciples of John. And then we also know Clement of Rome was a disciple of Peter. But what Papias tells us about Mark, here I'll read this first before I get into the real technical stuff. Here's what he wrote. And the presbyter said thus: Mark, having become an interpreter of John, or of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him, but afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities, and then in brackets, of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's saying. Wherefore Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them, for of one thing he took special care, not to omit anything that he heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements. Um, this is what Pius related regarding Mark. Um, with in regards to Matthew, I'll tell you what he says about Matthew's gospel. Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language. Each one interpreted them as best he could. The same person using proofs from the Epistle of John and from the Epistle of Peter in like manner, and gives also a story of a woman who was accused of many sins before the Lord, um, which is found in the Gospel according to the Hebrews. That's the Papias adultery, I believe. And the Gospel of the Hebrews is another. It's a variant on Matthew, and so is the Al-Khazite and the Gospel of. I mean, there were there was a bunch of variants of the Gospel of Matthew. One that the Ebionites used, and the Gospel of Matthew we have is a very Judaized gospel. So, and also, I'm going to talk about the synoptic um, issue, uh, where Matthew and Luke were both using Mark as a template. They were looking at Mark, and they also had another source, which is source, another thing, um, and that's how they created their gospels. But of Mark, Mark's style of Greek is unique among the gospels, all the gospels, unsophisticated and unrefined. Just look at Luke. Even in the English, and it's best to get the NAS because it's the most word for word translated, and you can really get the sense of it. It doesn't try to clean up anything. Mark is extremely rough. Um, with Luke, you can see the beauty of how Luke writes. Same with John. Um, Mark is often awkward and even improper. Mark is full of Latinisms, idioms, and vocabulary. Mark tends to conjoin verbs and sentences with kai, and um, in fact, more than half of all the verses in Mark begin with and. Um, it's again, I should point out again, Mark is fond of using the word immediately and again. It's ludicrous to put people. I see these dates, and even the damn evangelicals use them. Oh, Mark was written between 65 and 80. No possible way. Between 30 and 65. Or 30 and 60 is probably more likely. Yeah. And why I say 30 is because that passion narrative was very early. And that the final version of Mark that we have now is probably from about 60 to 65. The extended ending, the longer ending, may have come a little bit later. But remember, Pius is writing at a time before the Pericopiae Adulterae made it into John's Gospel. But Zoroaster, there was a guy on here who was calling himself Zoroaster, spelled with an X, that kept saying Markian. Markian is speaking about pertaining to the Gospel of Mark, but he meant to say Marcion, spelled Marcion. Cion is Sion. It's not can. Ridiculous. But let me just list off some things that are peculiar to that we how we know from Mark to oh Lord, where is it? The doubling, the dualisms. Here it is. Okay, Mark. Mark writes, when it was evening after sunset. Now, Matthew and Luke using this, Matthew just uses when it was evening. Luke, as the sun was setting. Mark says, the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Luke uses the leprosy left him. Matthew uses his leprosy was cleansed. Again, Mark uses the word that was sown in them. Luke, the word from their hearts, and Matthew, what was sown in his heart. Mark uses, they came to Jericho as Jesus and his disciples and a large group were leaving Jericho. Luke uses, as Jesus approached Jericho, and Matthew uses, as they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed them. Here's the last one I'll do. Mark, immediately as you enter it. Matthew says immediately, and then Luke uses as you enter it. Here would be the last one. Mark uses today, on this night. Luke uses today. Matthew uses this very night. So, and there's longer ones. Now, when evening had already come, since it was the day of preparation, being the day before the Sabbath, and Matthew uses when it was evening, and Luke uses it was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. Now, Mark also speaks of everything in the present tense, basically. Like he's telling you a story. We know the Gospel of Mark was written by somebody who was listening to Peter, right? There's nothing polished or refined. It's awkward. Just read the Gospel of Mark immediately. You'll read the Gospel of Mark and you'll go, okay, so Jesus did a few miracles, preached how everyone was equal, the Jews and the Gentiles. God loves them both, and they can both be good people and accepted by God. And you don't have to be Jewish. And then he was tortured and executed. But there's like, what, 2-3 parables maybe? There's not really that much teaching. Immediately he went here, and then immediately he went here, and that, and then, and. It's almost like listening to a 5-year-old. It's extremely primitive. And it has, what is it called? It has embarrassment to it. It says things that later on, or if somebody's trying to forward something, you wouldn't want it to have them. It meets the criteria of embarrassment, of, saying things like the apostles were afraid, or they didn't believe, or they were unable to do a miracle here. And it says strange things like one of the miracles that Jesus does, he tries to do a traditional way, and the guy says, I see men walking around like trees. That's weird for him to say that. The guy must have obviously said that, and then Jesus, on the second attempt, actually makes the blind man see. So Mark is the most interesting, and Mark is the only one to record that Jesus' brothers and sisters thought he was crazy. They thought he went nuts. So it paints the most accurate picture. And it doesn't start with the virgin birth. It starts with the baptism. And people say, well, why don't all four gospels have the virgin birth? Well, if you're writing about somebody, right, you would start at when they became famous. If you're writing about the important parts of their life, right? How would any of them have known about the virgin birth, right? Unless they were going and researching it, like Matthew did, like Luke did. But Mark was just traveling around with Peter and heard what Peter heard. And wrote it down, basically. Wrote down what Peter told him, as we hear Papias say, obediently. But yeah, that's why it's how, and that's why when people read Mark, they go, "What the hell?" And you have Luke and you have Matthew going, "Okay, well, we're going to use this as a template, but there's more to it, because there was oral tradition floating around. There were logoi. You have the Q source, which is where we get the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain. Because they're like, this can't be it. This doesn't tell you anything. It's just, okay, guy walked around, did a bunch of miracles, calls himself the Son of Man. One guy calls him the Son of God, but he never calls himself that. And then he's crucified. Okay, and there's no resurrection story at the end of it. So no wonder why we have Matthew and Luke. Matthew tries to Judaize it and tries to redact Mark and make it Judaize, and then that's why we had Luke come along and say, "Well, Matthew, you distorted the gospel. I'm going to return it to the gospel that Jesus obviously preached. That's in line with the Jesus that we see in Mark, but with a lot more parables and miracles and explanation of what things mean and resurrection account." All right, peace to you. That's the story of the Gospel of Mark. How you can read that and think, oh yeah, somebody obviously just made it ludicrous. Peace to you.